So thank you so much to the wider Chrysalis Festival, which has been programmed by a group of young people working with the National Centre for Writing. This event consists of a day of free online events which aim to reflect on and explore 2020. My name is Amelia Platt. I'm a sixth form student and a member of Literally Inside, which is the group of young people that have been working with the National Centre for Writing. So in this panel event, we will be exploring the theme of reading diversely, what that means, why it matters, and how we can incorporate this into our own reading and writing. This is such a powerful and important topic, and I'm beyond excited to be chairing this panel. So, without further ado, let's meet our wonderful panel who will now introduce themselves.
Hello, my name's Holly Ainley and I'm the book buyer and manager of the book department at Jarrold, which is an independent, family-owned department store in Norwich, in Norfolk. It's 250 years old. I live in Norwich, but before working here, I worked in publishing. I was a fiction editor, first for Myriad Editions and later for HarperCollins.
Following on from that, I'm Hannah Chukwu. I work for Hamish Hamilton as an assistant editor. Hamish Hamilton is an imprint that's part of Penguin Random House. And for them, I work on acquiring and commissioning literary fiction and literary non-fiction.
And I'm Somaya. I acquire lots of literary fiction and non-fiction in my capacity as a reader. My official job title, as official as it is writer, but I really think of myself as someone who reads and watches and listens and then responds. So I'm very excited to be part of this panel today because I think reading and the people who get the books to us are key to going forward with writing.
We are talking about reading diversity, and I think diversity is quite a tricky concept to pin down, and I think it can mean different things to different people. So I wanted to ask what diversity in literature and as a wider concept means to you as an individual.
I'm happy to kick off if anyone else. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, particularly, over the past year, I think there's been a huge spotlight on racial diversity in literature, and that's so important. But I was thinking a lot about what does it mean to me, and I think it means reading about any experience that's outside of my own, which is pretty much most of human experience, and I think that's really important to me. So whether that's sexual or gender diversity or class, racial diversity, all of those things, I think it I was trying to think back about kind of books that have been really pivotal for me in kind of stepping outside of myself and learning about what it's like for other people being in their shoes. And actually a lot of the books that came to mind were written by gay men, interestingly. For example, a book that will always stick with me is Derrick Jarman's Diaries. I found really powerful about the experience of being a gay man. And also, I read a long time ago Christopher Isherwood's Diaries, and they've really stuck with me. More recently, I'm a really big fan of the novelist Garth Greenwell, who writes just so beautifully about male gay relationships in his fiction. So that's been interesting, kind of looking back and thinking, gosh, yeah, they're the ones that kind of were really important to me. But more recently as well, I read the Booker Prize winner this autumn, Shuggie Bain, and that's just been that I found that a huge eye-opener. It's set in working class Glasgow, and if you want to know what it's like to live in poverty, then Shuggie Bain is just an absolutely incredible kind of window onto that. So I think for me, diversity is reading diversely, and that kind of term means, yeah, anything really beyond kind of my own experience.
I completely agree with that. And I've been thinking a lot as well about what that quite broad statement, diversity in literature, means to me. And I was thinking a lot about this last year and how we had that kind of explosion of specifically books by Black authors in the summer, which was like as a response to something that was happening globally and that everyone needed to kind of collectively understand and come to terms with. And the fact that there were books by Black authors that were at the top of the charts and were kind of leading that conversation, to me felt like an actual reflection of what it would look like if we had like an entirely diverse literature, if that makes sense, where when the conversation needs to be led by a group of people, like absolutely needs to be led by a minority group, like they are leading and have ownership and are being championed in that space, if that makes sense. So I think the kind of just knowing that there are authors from very diverse backgrounds writing and having their books on the bookshelves isn't quite the same as them kind of being able to lead the conversations they need to lead and being kind of accessible to everyone at the times when they really need to be. So that's been something I've been thinking about, and that kind of support at every level, because again, that felt like a time when the kind of the writers, the publishers, the booksellers, and the readers were all kind of in harmony with like who they were championing and who they were turning to. And if that being able to reflect what happened then in all of the different areas that Holly was talking about, I think is what it would look like for us to have like a truly, really diverse kind of literature in this country, globally as well. Yeah, that was something I thought about a lot with this question.
I work with an organisation called English Pen, which is, it's not a union, but it's a membership organisation for writers, journalists and editors, and particularly supporting freedom of expression globally. And they have a programme called Pen Translates, which supports books in translation from underrepresented voices. And they use the term bibliodiversity, which has an echo of another term that comes from ecology, which is biodiversity, which is a scientific term. And so I've been thinking about Amelia's question in relation to what is biodiversity. It doesn't, as Holly said, it doesn't just mean understanding a single category as diversity. It's a whole organic system. The reason that biodiversity is important is that everything is connected to each other. The wellness of an ecosystem depends on the health of the insects, the health of the plants, the health of the mammals, the health of the water. And publishing and reading are like that as well, both in terms of all of our roles and in terms of all of the people who are involved. So I was reading an article about something called the Sitka potato. Now, you're not going to find the Sitka potato in your supermarket unless you're shopping in the northwest coast of Canada or America. It's a potato that has a very specific habitat, and it was assumed to be lost. But the First Nations of that coast are recultivating it, and it's a potato that grows well in their particular soil and fits with their diet. You know, it was cultivated to be eaten with salmon and the herbs that grow there. And that's how I sort of think of bibliodiversity. As Holly said, you know, these are books that are sometimes about specific experiences or experiences told from specific points of view. But as Hannah said, it's also about who leads the conversation at a moment, and not just at a moment, but a moment that is also a redress of that absence, you know. So it's about this whole ecology and how everything fits together. And when one writer gets burdened with being singled out, then we're not thinking about diversity any more than when we're just saving the whales without saving the whole Arctic or Atlantic ecosystem. So it's a huge, complex, moving picture, but that also means that you can come into it at any point and engage in it with small actions and whatever lights your interest, and it will lead you onto other things because it's such a big map.
Thank you. That's been really interesting, listening to your talk, especially about, you know, the bestseller list and the impact, you know, we saw last year with that sort of shift. But I think there's also, you know, it's really interesting to hear you talk about how there's still a long way to go, because I think also, you know, it does beg the question, like, why did it take so long for this to happen? The question I'd like to ask next is, do you think in terms of, championing more diverse literature, do you think change is going to come from industry level, so from, publishing, booksellers, or does it come from below? Do we as readers need to be driving this process, through buying certain books, championing certain authors? I know it's kind of, we have that debate in terms of like climate change. Is it going to be the government that causes the change, or is it going to be us all making small individual changes? Do you guys have any thoughts on this?
Shall I follow up my ecology metaphor there? Because I think, Amelia's point is exactly right. And in fact, there's a bigger point there, which is that grassroots groups aren't just making small individual changes, they're holding companies and governments to account. When people come together because they want change, that is what creates it. And the ways that Holly, Hannah, and I all described our jobs, it's really clear, like, readers become writers, become publishers, become booksellers, publishers become booksellers, booksellers become writers. There's not a sort of strict separation, and the people who tend to make the most change are the people who move through those roles because there's something they want to change. So I'm thinking, for example, about Bernardine Evaristo now editing a list of Penguin of republished books by Black writers, which, sort of gives the lie to this idea that Black writing was sort of magically invented in 2020, which is the way that some, media like to present it. So really, her investing as an academic, as someone who's been an editor, in bringing these very established voices back into availability where they should always be, writers like C.L.R. James. So to me, that's when things are the most exciting, when someone who's a reader says, there's something that's missing for me, and they become a writer, or they start a magazine with their friends, or they decide to start a small press, or they decide that they're going to write to a publisher and say, why is this book out of print, or start a Twitter campaign, or they're going to study, at university and become an expert so that they can argue for the presence of certain kinds of writers and the importance of certain kinds of readers. Like, everyone has a different route to what they're committed to and where that change comes from, and it all mixes together. There is an important gap between that work and the people who are the gatekeepers, who are like the heads of companies, CEOs, the people who make the financial decisions. And that's the most difficult gap to bridge, is between what's happening among all of us who are working hard at every level where we're really engaging as readers, writers, booksellers, and then the people who are just the money people. And that gap in whether it's climate change, whether it's bibliodiversity, whether it's racial justice and abolition, that is the gap that capitalism makes in our society. And I'm not going to get on a rant now. There's lots and lots we can all educate ourselves about with this, but that for me is, like, as an activist as well as a writer, the big gap of how to translate all the incredible work and passion that's going on all the time to change how things are done at higher levels.
I would totally agree with that, and just to kind of follow that thread of a slight disconnect between grassroots and kind of very top level money people, as you described them. I think that I think a lot of people, when they say, is it kind of the industry or is it the readers, that quite maybe an easy answer is to say, oh, well, it's quite chicken and egg, and that, people have to, the industry have put the books out there, but if people don't buy them, then there's no incentive to keep doing it. But I think change takes a long time, and that the sort of the issue here is about the fact that publishing and bookselling and all these things, it's a industry, it's a commercial business, and there's lots of people, creative people, kind of making art, and I think a lot of people within the industry feel a real responsibility to kind of represent voices and all different kinds of voices. But then when from the top down you have a kind of real commercial pressure, whether that's, you know, within a bookshop that you work, or a publisher, and, you know, you're an editor and a book has to sell, it's really difficult, because you and I'm not saying it's an excuse, but I think perhaps it's why we're kind of stuck a bit, or have been stuck in a rut, is that, you know, traditionally readers buy a particular type of book, and so if that's your kind of surefire thing when you are a bookseller or you are a publisher and you need to make money, then you're going to end up sort of doing more of that because you're confident it will sell. And actually, I think that's where the kind of, like, we need to be allowed within the industry perhaps to take more risks, and also to be allowed to have a bit more time. Like, this is a systemic thing, I think, in the industry. I'm not sure that it is chicken and egg. I think readers do want different things, and just because the first time one of them comes out, or a few people try and they don't immediately hit the bestseller list, doesn't mean we should give up. I think it's about sustained kind of change and effort within the industry. I think it's a slight excuse of some people higher up to say, oh, well, the readers don't want it, so we're going to give it to them. That's yeah.
100% agree with you. I think so. I have just been in publishing for 2 years, and when I first joined, I came in on an editorial scheme that was specifically kind of looking for editors from underrepresented backgrounds, and that was the first time that Penguin, which is like the biggest of the publishers, like had done a scheme on that scale, when there were like 10 of us who all joined. And from joining, like, it's very obvious why they needed to do that. Like, it is historically an incredibly privileged industry, and I think that disconnect is so just so wide. And I feel incredibly grateful to have joined when I have, because it does feel like the pace is accelerating, like in a way that, you know, also publishing is a very traditional industry and can take a while to change, but it does feel like things are really accelerating in a way that they haven't before, from speaking to kind of colleagues who've been there for a lot longer. But so for some of my recent experiences, so working with Bernadine and on the Black Britain Writing Back series, she had been published with our imprint for like 20 years before she won the Booker Prize, and had never really kind of had the sales and the readers that she deserved until she was given a platform. And like, those readers weren't created, like they were always there, and they so that's why I think it, from my perspective, so much of it needs to come from the industry, because there's just no way that they, throughout the system, underrepresented writers were getting the support that they deserved, like the whole way through the industry, or were getting the attention or spotlight that they deserved, until very, very recently. And it does feel like a very marked change, but I think, we really need to like lead into that and really, really push on that, because it worries me that could stop being like accelerating at the pace that it is accelerating. So I completely agree with you, Holly, that can be like a bit of an excuse that we lean on, that things maybe or that they're not commercially viable, but I think those readers are there, and people want to read new exciting stories. Like, that's always been true, and that's what we've kind of all talked about diversity meaning as well, is just a difference and an exciting and new difference of opinion and perspective, and that's what all readers want to read. So I would say that it's very top down, but obviously, as we're kind of talking about what it means to read diversely ourselves, like, there definitely is also that kind of onus on us to remember what perspectives are outside of our own, and how that works the other way, and how that works back to writers, by like how we're supporting as readers writers who might not be getting support from other places just by buying their books or just by taking their books out of the library. Like, it's remembering, I guess, that we're an agent in all of those different ways, exactly as you said, so that we're kind of part of the system, even if we're not within the industry. You know, like, before I joined, I was still part of that system, but didn't really know it as intricately as I do now. But I think also readers should and can keep publishing houses accountable and booksellers accountable really for those things, because it's very difficult to like get to the very, very top with some of these things, and it takes people being loud about that as well, I think, to make that change really happen.
I just want to really quickly jump in on Hannah's point and say, as a reader, you can make someone's whole week, if not their month, a writer's whole week, by reaching out to them on Twitter or Insta and telling them what their book meant, especially perhaps if it was the first time you felt you'd connected with a particular kind of story or seen your perspective or a perspective close to you represented, or if it had educated you about an aspect of your history or your community, or educated you about something you'd never thought about before. Just as a writer, I can tell you that it's always incredibly exciting, like tingling from your scalp to your toes, just to know that someone's read your book with some attention and that it's meant something to them. And if it's inspired you to write, like, even better, share that as well. And the internet has just driven the power of readers. I think in some ways we wouldn't be seeing some of the changes that we've seen in the industry in the last 5 years without the power of book bloggers, the power of readers coming together to hold publishers and writers accountable. And I know there's a lot of like really dark talk about stuff like cancel culture and cancelling freedom of speech, but I think on balance, like, the passion of readers for ethical representation and honesty and accountability is, on balance, what will emerge and is so important. And I think being part of that can be really exciting, you know, even when you're, you know, 15, 16, 17, 18, like, you have the power to use your voice in a way that I certainly didn't. Like, I'm pre-internet in terms of my early reading. Like, I wrote fan letters for sure, but the collective power and opportunity, I think, is awesome. So use it wisely. But yeah, use it. Say hi.
I would absolutely agree with that point about literature having power and reading having power. You know, I've loved reading ever since I was little, hoping to study English at university. And I read, I think it was last month, a really powerful article in The Guardian talking about how they found in a UK study that just 5% of children's books had a Black, Asian or ethnic minority main character. And it really got me thinking about, you know, if I was in that position, would I have loved reading as much? Because I've been incredibly lucky that whenever I've gone into a bookshop, there's always been a book that had a character like me in it. And I think that is such a powerful thing. And I think part of, you know, my responsibility, I feel, is to sort of help those who perhaps don't see themselves represented, give them the space and the voice so that they can find that representation too, because I think books are incredibly powerful things. So I think I totally agree with everything that you said, and I think it's really interesting to see that link between, you know, literature as a wider industry and how that impacts upon the individual, and how the individual can impact upon the wider industry as well. And my next question really is going to perhaps shift the focus a bit more to the individual. And I wanted to ask, what do you think are the benefits of reading diversely on us as readers? If you want to also look at this from a writer's perspective as well, feel free to.
I remember those extremely kind of pivotal moments for me, which were like the first times where I found myself feeling represented. So one of the books was Red Dust Road by Kaye, it's an amazing book. It's like her memoir, and she like bizarrely has a very similar background to mine, and it was the first time I'd ever read about anyone who was mixed race, for one thing, and I didn't even know really that you could be a writer and mixed race, and that was like I'd read for a long time. I read that as like a teenager, and then similarly that year was the first time I read Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie as well, who also happened to kind of grow up in a village very near to my dad's in Nigeria. And again, it was just a whole new aspect of my identity that opened up that I was able to explore through having like that experience. So I'd say for me on a very personal level, like reading that kind of reading, which was, I guess would be like, is diverse because it's a minority kind of perspective. But for me, that was actually my whole world. And I hadn't really been allowed to read about that or allowed to like exist in that space as a reader until that moment, was so powerful and kind of really changed the way that I thought about myself, my identity, my history, changed some like my family relationships. And so that experience was extremely powerful. And I say on the other side, kind of how Holly was talking about at the beginning, I'd say that most of the books that have stayed with me and I feel like have impacted who I am as a person and kind of how I interact with the world have been from perspectives that are entirely different from my own. And I think I think that has only had a positive impact on my work life as well as my personal life, and is now what I seek out, really. Like that is what I find interesting and what I find exciting. And so that's kind of how it has impacted my life, I'd say.
I think that's amazing that you got to being a teenager and only then at that point found those, I mean, not amazing in a good way, but as in just astonishing. And it, makes me realize how different my reading experience might have been if I, wasn't who I am and hadn't had the background I had. But I agree about that. I feel excited when I read things that are quite far removed from my own experience. I think just at a really fundamental level, reading diversely increases our empathy. I mean, it's reading affects how we communicate with each other, with the world, what we contribute to society. I mean, I know that's might sound like an obvious thing to say, but I really believe it. And it's interesting you saying about reading as a child, because obviously that can be shaped from really early on. So it's so critical that children see diverse characters in books or a diverse range of authors, and believe that they can write or be whatever they want to be. But yeah, so empathy, I think, and also I think there's something to be said for feeling uncomfortable. I think it's quite important, actually, to read things that make you feel uncomfortable sometimes, because, I mean, it's a bit like the whole sort of social media thing that's happened with politics very recently, and kind of being in an echo chamber. What you're just kind of left open for surprise when something happens that you didn't plan for, and the same in kind of life, in every walk of life. If you don't know that other things exist or other perspectives exist, then you're just going to be surprised and disappointed. And actually it should be the opposite. It's something to be celebrated, and books which do make you feel perhaps uncomfortable, maybe there's a really good reason for that. Maybe it's important to challenge your own prejudices, or even realize that you had them in the first place. And so, yeah, I think for me, that's probably the kind of wider effect of reading diversely. I mean, it's a bit like, I wish we didn't even have to have that term, because I wish I didn't have to say, oh yes, I try to read diversely. I wish I just read and that was it. But yeah, I definitely do think about it and try and make a concerted effort, and it has lots of benefits.
I was just really struck by Hannah's phrase of that it was your whole world, that what other people have designated as niche or specialist, or all these words of containment, was your whole world, and I think that is what often happens with diversity. Is sort of, the idea is that it's this sort of round the world buffet where from a privileged position, people get to taste a little, and it's often very exoticized in the language of how we've all seen, you know, the identical book cover with the baobab tree at sunset that, you know, I know Chimamanda has spoken out against as well. And so what does it mean to move on from that, you know, stage, and to think about when we read a book, like going back to Holly's example of Derrick Drummond's Diaries, which, you know, I made a huge impression on me when I found them remaindered as a teenager. And I was a teenager under Section 28. I was queer. I didn't have the language for it. I grew up in an Orthodox religious household. To be given a whole world that I didn't even know existed, and that had parallels for me, that contained people who might be a bit like me or might welcome me, was such a startling experience that it's almost hallucinatory. And I guess in some ways I still look for those reading experiences, and I find them in, that's one reason I really love science fiction, is because it can use both allegory and inclusion, diversity. I'm thinking about writers like N.K. Jemisin, to ask us to confront those uncomfortable moments that Holly mentions, and to confront like the history of absences in our literature. I've also found myself going back to read a lot of like new contemporary YA and children's books and picture books, because I think actually there is a lot of like really dynamic work being done there. It sort of started in YA fiction because readers were standing up and asking for, like, and thinking about the hashtag Own Voices campaign, and it's just, you know, so many fantastic authors like Aidan Thomas's Cemetery Boys is probably the book I read most recently, but also writers like Nita Tyndall, and then picture book publishers like Jacaranda and Lantana. And it's almost like I want to go backwards and have those books in my childhood. So if I read them now, and if I read them with my nibblings, I can imagine that I had them then as well, and it sort of feeds you as a whole person. So I think reading diversity also means examining our prejudices about which genres we read and who we see certain books as being for. Like when a customer in the bookshop, I also work as a bookseller, says to me, "Oh, I don't read poetry," or "Oh, I don't read crime fiction," I think, well, you know, what about this one? And it's always a challenge for me to be like, okay, I'm going to find the crime fiction that people who don't read crime fiction read, because it has a fantastic setting or an amazing main character, or it deals with social and political issues that you're dismissing a genre, saying that it can't deal with. And as a science fiction fan, I'm really used to that kind of like, oh, that's just stuff for kids dismissal. And I'm like, well, if it's for kids, it's brilliant. You know, that's when we learn everything about the world. So I think that's a really powerful way of like challenging yourself to read outside perhaps the genres that you expect, or read writing from other countries as well in translation, which is something we do really badly in the UK. And yeah, to have that experience of like, oh, there is this whole world, and it's a whole world. Yeah.
I love that point, that reading diversity is also about challenging the genres we read. And I think that's probably one thing that we all have in common, kind of working in the industry, is that you by default need to read perhaps outside of your traditional comfort zone. And it is something I love. You know, for example, if we have an event or a visiting author who I think, oh, well, I probably wouldn't have picked that up, but because they're coming, I need to, and you know, you have this amazing reading experience, and it leads down all sorts of new reading pathways that you just wouldn't have had. So I think that's important as well, isn't it, about reading diversity, is that you can surprise yourself.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. That was, again, really interesting. It was actually really interesting hearing about maybe the downside to the label reading diversity. And I think we've talked a lot about the sort of positives, but I'm interested to ask if you think there are any negatives. I mean, is there a risk that we are sort of limiting writers, you know, pigeonholing them? Is it also, you know, that term like shallow diversity, where we might, I've seen lots of things actually last year on like websites where it's like the 10 most, the 10 best examples of diverse literature, and I wonder if there's perhaps a danger there. And I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on that.
I think it's a terrible adjective, diverse literature, diverse books. But when you use it as an adverb, diversely, it makes you think about an action. So what is reading? How do we do it? How can we set an intention for our reading practice? So, again, like hashtags on Twitter, like a year of reading women, where people set an intention and make it a statement and show the reason for that they're supplementing a historical lack or something that's been an absence in their own reading, then I think it is a really powerful term. But when it's used as kind of a marketing brand, it becomes meaningless. And that's true of any word. It's not just diversity that's affected by that, although because of the way in which lip service is too often paid to there being a whole world which contains historically complex human beings with power asymmetries, it is words around the politics of identity that often get taken up like that and, stripped of their meaning. So it's like, it's not do we fight to reclaim it or find another term. It's like, how can we set an intention that's maybe a shared intention where we know what we mean and we're arguing the nuances of that, but we're doing it, and use that to, as you said, Emilia, shape the landscape so it no longer has to be a term. I think that's what's exciting, and there are painful and uncomfortable conversations to be had in there as well that are really important about what the intention is and who engages in it and who has the voice on it. But I think the important thing is doing it with a clarity for yourself about what your intention is and how you're sharing that, and what you want to come out of that.
I think one of the trickiest things with the term, in terms of if you're talking about like diverse authors or like kind of it being given to an author, is I think often that they then can feel that they are kind of the voice for that entire like group of people, especially if they're the kind of most prominent voice or maybe most successful writer in that space, that then they'll often, that kind of becomes a revolving door of they'll then get asked to speak on specific issues that kind of relate to that whole group, even if that's outside of what they've written about or really outside of their experience, but because that's kind of the most well-known person we know, like in that space, they'll get given those kind of jobs. So I think that can be very tricky, is when authors feel like they maybe have a responsibility to really speak for an entire group in a way that people from more privileged aspects of society never really need to think about. Like they never really need to think about the fact that they're, speaking for their entire generation or, anything like that. And I think that can really affect how writers feel about their work as well. I mean, I'm saying all of this, and so you are a writer, so feel free to contradict me if any of this is not true. But from working with writers, I can see that how they can feel that, and yeah, sometimes they are pushed into those spaces. So it's tricky because it's something we need to talk about, and it's something we want to encourage people to do. But at the moment, we are still at a stage where there aren't really enough writers right at the front who are from underrepresented backgrounds for it to be like, there's to be endless, like infinite books that we read that cover all of the perspectives that they need to, and that's where we want to be. But at the moment, like, we're just not there. So I think that can be really tricky for authors to kind of hold as a mantle of responsibility.
I mean, this panel is a great example of how to do it, because it's about practice. You're asking all of us about what our work practice is, what our process is to reflect on that. And as a writer, as someone who's done events with writers like Holly has and interviewed filmmakers, I know that what creative people and people working in the creative industries like to talk about is their practice, because people hone it, they develop it, they talk to each other about it. So as a film critic, I wrote a book about feminist cinema called Political Animals. And I spent 2 years sitting on panels that were basically like, whoa, so women make films. I was like, there are 500 of them in this book. Women, trans, non-binary, two-spirit, gender non-conforming filmmakers. Maybe we could stop resetting the discussion to the most basic setting, because, you know, as Holly says, there's always this industry assumption, oh, readers don't know what they want, oh, viewers don't know what they want. Actually, readers and viewers are really sophisticated and are ready for sophisticated conversations like this that are about practice and process and come from different angles and bring up uncomfortable topics and throw things back out to the audience, rather than this like super basic reset mode that seems to rule a lot of like the bigger or more corporate literary festival modes. And I think if you start with that in mind, then it's not like that phrase diverse writer just like collapses, doesn't it?
From a bookselling perspective, I just wanted to add something to that question of whether or not it's useful to have the labels, because as you were both talking, I was thinking back to last year and that kind of real burgeoning of books that fit the kind of Black Lives Matter label, because that's what we're talking about here. And I was thinking that, you know, we in the department had, you know, we react, you know, a lot of book selling is to be reactive, is to pick up on current trends. I'm not saying you can't be trendsetters as well, but, you know, you people are kind of, you react to what's going on in the media. So of course we had a display with books related to that subject, you know, by lots of Black writers. We had fiction, we had non-fiction, we had new stuff, we had, and of course, you know, you put together this this table display and it's great and people are buying from it. But actually then what happens when suddenly it drops out of the media and people aren't talking about it anymore? And I think when it becomes not useful is, okay, so what would booksellers then do with those books? Are you sending them all back? Because actually the thing that we need to get to a point, and which I really feel kind of is my responsibility as a book buyer for an independent, therefore where I do have some agency, is to keep those books on the shelves all the time, and is not to have them in a section of the shop that's just about kind of race or the history, racial history, is to have them just on the shelves, like you were saying, Hannah, about you know, it does kind of feel like we're not quite at the point where those voices are threaded through enough into every subject. So there's a tendency for them to get put on one display or put bunched all together, but actually that's not enough. And booksellers kind of have an opportunity to say, okay, I'm going to try and represent and through all genres, and not just put something into, you know, I know it's useful to group some things, like people might come into the shop and ask, do you have a gender studies section? And obviously then it's useful to be able to say, okay, these books are specifically related, but at the same time, there should be books in every genre that kind of reflect those experiences. So I think although it's helpful, again, going back to the fact that bookselling and publishing is a commercial industry, it can be useful, and you kind of can make sales in a really positive way because you know that you're kind of educating people, but at the same time it's no good at just being short term or tokenistic. It needs to be there all the time.
You guys have led really well into my next question, which was all about putting the intention to broaden our reading into practice. So I was very lucky. I live in Norfolk. I live in a tiny village in rural Norfolk, and I went to quite a small high school, and I had an absolutely fantastic school librarian who really challenged all of our reading. She always had fantastic suggestions, and she really pushed us. I'm a huge fan of school librarians. I don't think they get the recognition that they deserve. But not everyone will have that space or that person to offer them tips or suggestions. And so it can be hard, especially if you're like a young reader. Where do you even start? And so I was wondering if you were going to say like one tip for how we could go about diversifying our bookshelves and challenging and pushing our reading, what would your tip be?
Oh man, all the love for librarians, especially this year. School librarians, local librarians, and also teachers. I don't think I've ever met a writer, or very few writers, who haven't had that one teacher or librarian or youth leader who was the person who said to them, "You can do this." And it's not always in a formal education structure either. It's sometimes with like a community centre, creative writing group, or it was a social worker. So yeah, I mean, my brain just went completely blank. Book trust, I would say, especially like for younger readers or people caring for younger readers, book trust are absolutely brilliant. Both their website and on Twitter, that's what they do. And I think it's being alert, because like you never know where it's going to come from. So I grew up in a suburb of London that was predominantly conservative Jewish, but we had really subversive librarians who faced out LGBT books in our local library. And I didn't even know what they were or why they were faced out, but somehow, like as I said, Derrick Drummond's Diary, Jane Rule, queer Jewish poets like Adrienne Rich were somehow finding their way into my hands. And like that secret librarian who did that, I can't imagine what their life was like living in that suburb as a gay person in the 1980s. But they saved my life. And you just never know where that's going to come from. Like, obviously now we have a million tools online. You can follow writers and follow book bloggers, and there are so many great websites made by teachers and librarians and YA and MG writers that are full of recommendations, but also just like being open to that magical moment of connection, that it could be a book crossing, that someone's left a book. I know no one's really doing that this year because of germs, but it used to happen. Or a book that you unexpectedly love the cover of when you see it on Overdrive or your library. Like, take a chance on what it might be saying to you that you don't yet know about yourself. That's what happened for me. So that's my combination of tips. Is like, there's a lot of pragmatic, useful stuff out there, and there's also magic. And it also, like Amelia, you said you were reading books for A-level at the moment. I know that can be like a really endurance task, but sometimes like 20 years later, you come back to them and you're like, actually, this book really had a lot to say to me. Or you come back to them and you're like, I can't believe I was made to read this at school. It's horrifying. So like the opposite of Hannah's experience as a teenager of like finding those books is like, sometimes the things you get in school will like inspire you, and sometimes they will enrage you. And those can both lead you to other things as well.
I don't know if my tip would be, I feel like it's less of a tip for actually a younger reader, but perhaps more just touching on that sort of responsibility. I am a bit hesitant to call it that, but I think so, of schools and of teachers, because let's face it, like for a lot of children, that is the only place where they might have access to books. And just listening to So talking about their experiences, and I was so lucky. I grew up in the Midlands, which is culturally a really diverse place anyway. And I went to a school, I think with maybe like 250 pupils, and less than half of them were white. We had a massive Indian, like Hindu community, and also a really big Afro-Caribbean community. So for me, school was already a place that, you know, we weren't just celebrating Christmas and Easter, we were celebrating Diwali. Like in my music lessons, I learned harmonium and I was in the steel band. And like the kind of people I was with, I guess it was about it didn't mean anything to me as a child, but kind of looking back now, it was the teachers sort of reacting to that and kind of saying, all right, let's celebrate all these different cultures and these different experiences. So I feel like my tip is more for teachers is to kind of embrace what's right in front of you. And to listen and like, if I hadn't have had all those experiences, like I'm just thinking now of John Agard, the poet, kind of coming into school and that being like my first kind of wow connection to poetry, and he, you know, that was just amazing, and that was just purely through school. So I think it's celebrating, and then celebrating what's in front of you, but also then if you know the school is very different and it happens to be a really predominantly white kind of middle class area, then there's a different kind of responsibility, is to go, okay, what's missing, what are the gaps? So I feel like now I'm giving some kind of primer for teachers, and I know it's not that easy, but is to kind of is to recognize and celebrate the cultures of what's right there, and to share. I think encourage children to share their own stories with each other, because that's how I feel like I got lucky in my childhood.
I was just going to say also, for like, just to bring Holly's point around, is also for students and young readers, like, ask your teachers. Teachers have been trained, they're supposed to be experts in their subject, they have lots of research tools that you might not have access to. If there's something you're not seeing in the school library, if there's something that you want to connect with that's not there, ask the teacher, ask the librarian, and it may be that that's something they haven't had an opportunity to think about, and they'll really relish it, and have that opportunity to bring things in, to advocate for, you know, the head to set the money aside for that, and to really create that, and to perhaps work with you to bring a writer into a school. That's so important as well, that connection. I mean, at the moment it's like Zoom readings, but to connect young people to a real, like, wide swathe of writers, so that they can hear from working class writers who also might still have day jobs, that they can hear from writers who started writing when they were much older, that they can hear, you know, from writers from immigrant backgrounds, writers from care experience backgrounds, because that's also really important, that young people are like, oh, I could also be a writer, I could also be a publisher, not just from reading the books, but from seeing people's faces and asking them questions. And that's something that, like, I think everyone can work on together, bringing into schools and libraries, and, like, you know, writers love it and publishers love it. So yeah,
I mean, both of your answers were absolutely amazing, and actually really challenged me, because I forget really that working in publishing, like, I just have access to books in a way that I never have at any other point in my life, and I kind of, I don't know, forget that that's not what everyone has all of the time, and that that's a very different situation to be in, and that I remember feeling very hungry for things that weren't there, and so it can be very difficult when we're kind of talking about, like, looking for books that talk about all these different experiences, and, like, a lot of them just aren't accessible, and that's, like, a completely valid and challenging point as well. The kind of main thing I wanted to say really is that there's just no rules with reading, which is, like, the most exciting thing about it, and a lot of the time it is something that's it's just entirely for you, and, like, it's, you know, for me it's always been, like, a very important, like, place for myself, like, because it was always time that was entirely for myself. So I guess remembering that, like, you know, when you're trying to navigate that age when you're like, should I still be reading YA? Should I be reading adult fiction? Like, there are no rules. You can be reading whatever you want to read at any time. Like, just because you've never read nonfiction before, like, and no one else you know is reading nonfiction, like, again, there are no rules. You can go for that. And I guess just remembering that there's a lot of fun to be had in that process of just, like, discovering things, and also you can start things and just stop them if you're not interested. Like, it's the exciting thing is being able to just start something, open something that's, like, entirely different, and kind of using the approach that you probably use to, like, other experiences in your life, like meeting new people, going to new places, like, you, like, thinking about that in terms of books and reading, that, like, all of these different books are an entirely new place, an entirely new experience, and you get to just, like, try and step into that whenever you want. yeah, I think that would be my take.
Thank you guys so much. I think that's a really perfect point to end it on, with that discussion of schools and the future, the idea that we need systemic change, but it is already happening. I feel very hopeful after this discussion, hearing all of your lovely points. So thank you so much for all of your fascinating answers. We really appreciate you for giving up your time and providing us with such amazing, detailed, beautiful answers. Thank you also to our audience for watching this discussion. We really hope you come away from this inspired and infused to read. Thank you so much.